I'm excited to have Victoria Baines join us to talk about scenarios for the future of cybersecurity, and I'm going to let her actually talk about her background because she'll do a much better job than me reading from a script. So thank you so much, and welcome again, and looking forward to a great week. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I made the bold decision this morning of wearing lipstick under my face mask. So if you could, just please let me know. If I look like the clown from It, Pennywise, we've got a problem. So thank you. I'm hoping it won't slip in the course of my talk. I'm absolutely thrilled to be addressing you here today. And I feel pretty smug that I'm based in the UK because I'm so used to traveling to meetings, at least in pre-COVID times, and being the person with the jet lag. So I feel your pain. I'm going to empathize with you a little bit. I know there are lots of people in this room who are still on the wrong time zone. So don't worry, I won't take it personally if you nod off for a little bit. But I do have a background in teaching, and I used to have to teach intermediate Latin language at 9 a.m. on a Friday when Thursday night was the cheap night out. So I've become really, really good at certain things like throwing pointers, walking up to people and going, boo! I also know that you are in one of the best parts of London for pubs. It is absolutely no coincidence that the National Crime Agency, the successor of the Serious Organised Crime Agency, my former employer, is just around the corner from here, because the pubs are great. So I also sympathise entirely if you had a little bit too much fun last night. If you had a little bit too much fun last night and you're jet lagged, frankly, you get a medal for being here. I don't have pin badges. I love the fact that we've had at least one person honest enough to put their hand up in the background there, punching the air. Come on, I'm here. Fantastic. Yes. If take a virtual pin badge from my heart, okay? So I'm not actually a first-time attendee at the morgue, and I'm really, really pleased to be back. It's almost a decade since I attended the 2013 meeting in San Francisco, when we had a fantastic keynote from Kara Swisher. And I presented on behalf of the European Cybercrime Centre. I was still working at Europol. I was still doing the EU's cyber threat analysis, and we were just building the European Cybercrime Centre. And if you don't mind, I'm going to take you back to that time. It's relevant to what I'm going to talk about in terms of the future from our viewpoint here in 2022. So 2012, 2013, what did we have? Well, whether you like it or not, it was the pre-Trump era. Whether you like it or not, it was the pre-Brexit era. And I have to say, I personally am still mourning that one. It was the time before the Sony hack. It was the time before WannaCry, not Petya. We knew about ransomware, but we're only just really starting to work on it, weren't we? So things have changed in that intervening time. What we tend to feel, don't we, is that uncertainty characterizes, and I'm just going to use there we go, that does work. For some reason, the clicker might not be working, but let's see. Uncertainty characterizes how we feel about the future. And you will hear and you will see this quote quite a lot. It's sometimes ascribed to the Danish Nobel Prize-winning physicist Niels Bohr, but it is disputed. You'll see it apocryphally used quite a lot. And humorously to point out that it is difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. Now, what does that uncertainty do? Well, sometimes it makes us play safe. It makes us write threat prediction reports for the next year that sometimes, and arguably all too often, say things like, there will be more ransomware, there will be more business email compromise, there will be more supply chain attacks. We play it safe, don't we? We just, to some extent, we say there's going to be more of what we saw this year. And that's fair enough, but I'm here to challenge you to think a little bit further beyond that next year and more of the same. Because lots of folks in lots of organizations, be they public, private, or third sector, have 5-year plans, have 10-year strategies. And so thinking to the next 6 months of information and cybersecurity means you risk missing things. You risk something like ransomware becoming a national security issue. Now, that example is quite pertinent because a couple of weeks ago, I was in a seminar with a senior law enforcement officer, and I'm not going to say which country, and I'm not going to say which agency. And they quite angrily remarked, why is it that nobody predicted that ransomware would become a national security issue? Now, like many of you, I expect right now, I thought, well, I did. A bunch of us did. So what happened? How come those signals and our raised hands were missed? It says something about the process of how we prepare. It says something about that really, really important priority of your group, readiness. How do we get across to people that threats evolve, and they don't necessarily evolve as just more of the same, an increasing number of the same types of attack. Uncertainty, that feeling of, well, we can't possibly anticipate the future with any, kind of accuracy, so why bother, is also why we constantly feel surprised. So without wanting to denigrate one of my former employers, it is quite telling that in 2016, when Mark Zuckerberg said that the sowing of Russian disinformation on Facebook was a crazy idea in the run-up to the 2016 US federal election, I don't think he was being deliberately devious, but it hadn't occurred to him personally that could happen. But again, for those of us in this room that work on the evolution of cyber threats, it's kind of a logical conclusion, isn't it? That if we have a Russian propaganda disinformation machine that is at least 70 or 80 years old, and we have a tool for content generation like massively popular social media, that they might use it. And I would argue that there are certain constants. I've been tracking changes in cybercrime and cyber threats for the best part of 20 years. And I have noticed a couple of things that don't change and that I believe are a reliable basis for us to look into the future. So I would like to replace this quote from Niels Bohr with this one that I can tell you is absolutely undisputed because I said it. Uncertainty is no excuse for failing to prepare. Yes, if you work in information security for an organization, you have to justify procurement choices. You have to justify your board spending money on a thing. And I completely get it that you can't say, well, in 10 years' time, we're going to have to worry about physical assault in the metaverse, therefore we need to buy this thing now. I understand that might not wash with your boards, but I hope I'm going to be able to convince you that some of the drivers and trends and potential changes in the operating environments are things that it's worth you thinking about and being aware of now, so that when the time comes, you're not going to be taken by surprise. Okay, my constants that I think are a reliable basis for thinking about the future of cybersecurity. 1, technology constantly evolves. No, I didn't hear any grumblings. Good. Some people want to harm other people and assets. We're not all suddenly going to become angels, are we? No. Good. These people will exploit the technology available to them, perhaps to differing degrees, perhaps with different geographical distributions. But if you are criminally minded or malicious and technology is available to you, you will at least explore whether you can misuse that technology or indeed target that technology. So on that basis, and some of you may recognize this if you were at the meeting in 2013, when I was at Europol, I convened a team of relevant folks from our data protection office, from our legal team, our cybercrime investigators, our organized crime investigators, and other relevant folks. And I set up Project 2020. And the aim was precisely on those three bases to anticipate the future of cybercrime and to enable governments, businesses, and citizens to prepare themselves for the challenges and opportunities of the coming decade. That was in 2012, kind of looking ahead to 2020, so just shy of a decade. We built scenarios, nothing more than writing stories that described a possible future. And emphatically not linear predictions that by 2020, this will happen and this will be a problem. But by describing that world where we had converging technologies, so not the future of blockchain, the future of AI, and the future of quantum, but all of those interacting in a single world, to elicit the implications for an ordinary internet user, a manufacturer, a communication service provider, and a government. For all of those to think about the specific criminal threats and activities that could happen in that world, and to elicit those key considerations for all of those different cybersecurity stakeholder groups. And we were really, really careful to make sure we weren't just thinking about large organizations. We were also thinking about small and medium-sized enterprises and ordinary citizens. So very, very briefly, the methodological part, well, you have to have a baseline. So in 2012, we synthesized all of the current trend and threat reporting, those predictions, and we said, right, where are we right now? Then we did our horizon and environmental scanning, and to do that, we trawled through open source information, through patents at the World Intellectual Property Office database, and through scientific abstracts. And we had a fantastic afternoon one day in 2012 where a bunch of us all just sat down with all of these abstracts and these patents. We mapped them, post-its, of course, because that's how you do scenario exercises. We mapped them on a wall and said, well, how would that fit in with that? And how would that be used in an integrated transport system, etc.? We then took our timelines, our best guesses for when we thought some of these technologies would come online and some of these technologies would be in mainstream use. And we took them to a workshop of information security professionals hosted by the International Cybersecurity Protection Alliance, the ICSPA. And they told us whether they thought our timelines were crazy, reasonable, or under-ambitious. And on the basis of that, we then wrote these stories. And this is some kind of rendering of what this world looks like. Welcome to the Republic of South Sylvania, which some of you may remember from the San Francisco meeting. It is a middle-income economy that to some extent has leapfrogged larger economies because of its clever use of research and technology. And for that, we had current inspiration in 2012 of Eastern Africa developing the M-Pesa and other mobile payment systems and really stealing a march on other mobile payment developments in much better funded countries. We have our citizen, Kiniko, so named because I liked the name, and it was a friend of mine who did her PhD with me, and she was from Japan. We have Synesys Enterprises that makes, if you like, a turbocharged Roomba that has become a home help device and friendly robot. And we have La Cucha, the communication service provider. Why La Cucha? Well, it was the only fruit name that I could find that hadn't already been trademarked. So we got to 2019. And by then, Trend Micro, under the leadership of Rick Ferguson, had released an award-winning series of short films drawing on those scenario narratives that we had written. And Rick approached me and said, you know, it's 2019. It was actually November 2019, so peak Blade Runner. And we thought, well, in the spirit of looking into the future, in the spirit of imaginative science fiction, I wonder if we have an opportunity to look back and see how we did with our scenarios. Now, lots of people do futures exercises. Lots of people do scenarios. Very, very rarely do they look back to see how accurate and relevant they might have been. So I jumped at the chance to do this. This was an unprecedented opportunity for me to find out how terrible my work had been. Imagine being given that opportunity, you know, and taking into account Niels Bohr's quote, I was fully expecting that we would have done very, very badly. However, and you can find this in a white paper that we published online under this name. However, when we look specifically at the cyber criminal activities that we had not predicted, but built into our imagined world, we found that 84% of them had manifested in one way or another by 2020. It's more challenging, and actually we abandoned this attempt, it's more challenging to identify how mainstream they were, because how do you set those degrees? When does something become mainstream as a cyber threat? But to say that 84% were present wasn't bad. It suggested that the use of our three constants, our three premises, and the way we had built the scenarios through that methodology was kind of okay and worth doing again. So of course, that's what we did. And what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my talk is what we got out of Project 2030, which we released at RSA last year. The white paper is available online as well, so you just Google Project 2030 Scenarios for the Future of Cybersecurity, but I will supply a link in subsequent slides. We used the same method, pretty much. We looked at current signals, but from the perspective of 2019, 2020, synthesizing those threat reports. And what we realized as soon as we started following this procedure is we had a problem in 2019 and 2020. Why? Because, well, if you remember, in 2012, it was only really us in this room that cared about cybersecurity. It wasn't a big media issue. We couldn't, at Europol, we couldn't really get people to care about it very much. It was quite a challenge. Now, keeping up with the number of trend and threat reports that are out there is really challenging, isn't it? We've got too much information now. No wonder we're being asked to consider automated responses to cyber threats. Equally, when it came to environmental and horizon scanning via open source material, there is so much media coverage of information and cybersecurity now that it's really, really challenging to even scratch the surface of it. Patents, the number of patents in the World Intellectual Property Office's database with the phrase artificial intelligence in them, any guesses? A lot is absolutely right. It's now in the millions. It's in the millions. So the proliferation of the technologies that we call emerging, but already there are scientific projects to develop specific technologies in these areas. And so as a result, the abstracts attached with that are also in the millions. And then when you look at quantum, at blockchain, smart cities, etc., massive IoT, it just layers on top. So we had to find a more systematic way of going through that than getting 9 people in a room and reading all the abstracts. We also had the pandemic to deal with. And so that meant we couldn't run workshops as we had originally planned. And that is where, of course, online surveys came to our rescue. And we had a fantastic time developing hypotheses, developing statements around the timeline that we could test with information security practitioners from a range of organizations, but also including organizations like the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, all the groups of information security practitioners that we could think of. And one of my favorites of those was, by 2030, we will print meat at home. And again, we asked the same questions. The sliding scale, is this too ambitious? Is this about right? Or is this not ambitious enough? Other questions. By 2030, cybersecurity will largely consist of AI offense and defense. Every day will be 0 day. By 2030, AI will report a breach before humans even know about it. Got some compliance obligations there to think about. By 2030, countries will launch cyber attacks on each other by mistake and with no human intervention. Okay, so you're all thinking of the current signals that we might already have and how we might plot that out. On the basis of that validation or discounting, in some cases, of our timelines, we then wrote our stories. And in doing so, in considering that world, we took into account at least all of these aspects of the world or in the wider operating environments. And there are others. And of course, they interlink as well. And in considering the technologies, we also took into account at least all of these. And of course, we thought about how they would interlink. So if we're thinking about what we're now calling the metaverse, apparently, but if we're thinking about VR and AR, of course, you need AI, 5G, 6G, to make that a mainstream reality, at least for consumers. If we're thinking about space technology, that also allows us to think about how IoT and additive manufacturing, 4D printing, might interact in space. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. So we had to come up with a name. And yes, I cheated. Because what I really would have liked was San Francisco. But as Big Hero 6 fans will know, that had already been taken. So, wanting to combine the best of the Bay Area and the best of East Asia, we came up with New San Joban. Joban for the train line in the area of Tokyo, San for your kind of California feel, and new because we wanted it to be novel. And guys, I'm going to switch to the video. Thank you.
Good morning, New San Jovan. It's Monday, August 26, 2030. Some call him a visionary. Others accuse him of exploitative employment practices. But none can ignore the impact that Corlo Industries CEO Richard Graves has had.
To all the misfits, slackers, dropouts, graduate universities struggling right now, oh, I feel you.
Good morning, New San Jovan. It's Monday, August 26, 2030. Some call him a visionary. Others accuse him of exploitative employment practices. But none can ignore the impact that Corlo Industries CEO Richard Graves has had.
To all the misfits, slackers, dropouts, graduate universities struggling right now, oh, I feel you. I was laughed at in high school. See, I was shy. Man, I had a terrible stutter. The teachers completely wrote me off. No one believed in me.
All you tech fans out there, get ready. The annual Corlo Industries Keynote is upon us. So, what will they surprise us with this time?
Because life is short, my friends. I failed so many times, man, they thought I was crazy.
Good morning, New San Jovan. It's Monday, August 26, 2030. Some call him a visionary. Others accuse him of exploitative employment practices. But none can ignore the impact that Corlo Industries CEO Richard Graves has had.
To all the misfits, slackers, dropouts, graduate universities struggling right now, oh, I feel you. I was laughed at in high school. See, I was shy. Man, I had a terrible stutter. The teachers completely wrote me off. No one believed in me.
All you tech fans out there, get ready. The annual Corlo Industries Keynote is upon us. So, what will they surprise us with this time?
Because life is short, my friends. I failed so many times, man, they thought I was crazy. I focused on what I wanted from life. And so should you. So I say to you, don't give up.
I suspect they're going to announce the next generation of 4D medical implants. It's been a while since the last update.
Hospitals have been installing these smart devices into old or sick people for years.
Yes, to improve their quality of life.
Or to be able to get rid of those who cost the system a little too much, or eliminate undesirables or political rivals.
San Joban that is familiar, rolling news. And it's New San Joban, by the way, not Hoban. I'm quite attached to my original pronunciation as I envisaged it. So 4D medical implants, though, that's taking us a slight bit further, isn't it? So the idea that we might have Corlo, Consolidated Rubber and Logistics, which originally started out in the 19th century as one of those large rubber companies that went into tire manufacture, that went into, manufacturing rubber boots in the 20th century, that then got military contracts, that then, in the context of the great pandemic, went into medical manufacturing, that they might be producing self-healing polymers that could then be used for self-folding stents for cardiovascular interventions. That we have a citizen or a consumer, Rusilla, who, by the way, is imagined as a woman of color, because we don't have enough of those in cybersecurity, or at least they're not visible and audible enough, and her family. And Rusilla doesn't drive a car. The car's sat in the garage for many, many years because we have an integrated transport system. She's involved in a community energy and power generation scheme. She has a 14-year-old son called Kojo, who is bugging her for a neural implant because he's seen one of his elderly relatives has one for medical reasons, and he quite likes the idea of being able to game at the speed of thought. Rusilla does indeed print some of her own food at home, but also medication for her elderly father. So you can see, with our information security hats on, you can see all of those opportunities for misuse and targeting. I mentioned about Corlo Industries with their self-healing polymers and their self-folding medical stents, but also those self-healing polymers are used in undersea cables. are also used in space in relation to low Earth orbit satellites. And with 4D manufacturing, of course, we have the opportunity for items to be shipped to space in flat packs and then to self-assemble on receipt of the appropriate stimulus. So while we didn't hugely take this into space, it was nice to have that slightly intergalactic feel to it. The government, New San Joban, is a city within a larger country. It is entirely cashless, and we considered, well, who might actually use cash in the future? Well, only criminals, possibly. Traditional organized crime groups might be the only people using cash. And so potentially law enforcement could identify criminal elements in society purely by whether they still used cash or not. And we envisaged that probably it would only be older people in society who would still be using debit and credit cards. There has just been a referendum, and I still feel very sore about referenda. There has just been a referendum in the wider country for the use of a single digital identity. In New San Joban, 73% of the populace rejected a single digital identity that would tie up your healthcare with your education, with your voting, whether you recycled your bins, your rubbish properly, etc., your use of public transport. In the wider country, it was more divided. So for those of you who followed the Brexit referendum here in 2016, 52% rejected the single digital identity, 48% were for. So it sounds like there's still all to play for. But what we also have are people who, for ethical and moral and privacy concerns, are rejecting this greater aggregation of data. We call them the splitters, and they effectively live off-grid outside the New San Joban city limits. Okay, you can read this all in detail, but rest assured, I'm not going to go through a 40 or 50-page report in any kind of granular level. But from that world, we're able to elicit those criminal activity categories. And let me pull out a few of these for you. They'll all look very familiar, but they take on a slightly different flavor according to the developments of new technologies or further developments in technologies. So we're looking at things like unauthorized access and intrusion, unlawful interception, unauthorized data exposure, doxing, etc., data manipulation, denial of service, of course, and disruption, misuse of processing power, extortion, which I'm not calling ransomware, I'm calling it extortion because there are other opportunities available, and influence operations, of course. So to pull out a couple of those, with massive IoT, we envisaged a world in which streetlights could be made to dial premium phone numbers, premium rates, and develop a stream of revenue for the criminals picking up those fees. We also envisaged a world in which semi-autonomous weapons could be stolen, could be used as bargaining chips for extortion, could be retailed illicitly, and could be interfered with. A world of increasing automation of business processes means that operational technology is probably going to be, or could be, more of a direct target than humans working in a business. So if we think about business email compromise, that could actually happen less in a world of greater automation, because you'll have fewer people to email and hoodwink. What you might have instead is business process compromise, about infiltrating the OT. And as we know, this is becoming more of a concern anyway. We already have current signals for this. But the greater the automation, the greater the premium on getting into that process and compromising it, diverting funds, interfering with the process that way. We certainly looked at data manipulation in terms of data poisoning attacks. So the more AI will be used in business and organizational processes in our daily lives, the greater the premium, the greater the interest in manipulating that source data to generate adverse outcomes, and whether that's to impact on an organization's reputation or just to sow societal discord in the sense of disinformation, then that is something that I would argue, and that our scenarios tell us, we need to be starting to prepare for. And then in terms of influence operations, particularly interested in those immersive environments or extended reality, where your news feed is now no longer delivered on a screen at your arm's length, but is delivered in your line of sight in some way. And whether that's, heads-up display, or whether it's headphones that allow you to have additional features, this idea that already we have synthetic news generation, we have immersive news being developed by Reuters and other organizations. You will receive your news here, not there. So what does that mean for people's critical thinking? What does that mean for developing people's resistance to fake news? Because you can't detach yourself from something that's here. You don't have that automatic reflex to check what you've seen. Put your screen down, walk away for 5 seconds and think, I wonder if that's true. That sounds like, that doesn't smell quite right. And if your legitimate news is delivered in line of sight, then how do you distinguish between what is legitimate and what is illegitimate? Equally, we may have real-time deep fake of family members asking for money to be transferred. We may have fake news and disinformation delivery that's not about a static news item. It's about a person, an avatar coming up to you and trying to persuade you of something in a highly realistic manner. Again, more difficult to control and divorce yourself from. So as much as we're currently going down a road of tackling fake news and disinformation by technical means, and as much as that is sensible, we're still going to need to enhance how we develop, quote unquote, quote, ordinary people's critical thinking and judgment skills. When we're thinking about wider considerations for cybersecurity stakeholders, well, we had some great answers from the people that we sent our questionnaire and the survey to, because we gave them a free text option to tell us what they thought we'd missed and anything else that they wanted to add. And what came through very, very clearly is that there will be changes to the business of cybersecurity. We would expect that. And we mentioned about automation. Clearly, we are moving towards greater automation in cybersecurity, not least because of the sheer volume of data being generated, the sheer volume of red flags, suspicious incidents, etc. And I had a great quote from one of the respondents, which said, within 5 years, SOC analysts will be data scientists. For any of you SOC analysts who are thinking you might like a career change, you might want to just hang on a couple of years because this person might well be right. We've been talking, haven't we, for a couple of years about automation taking the grunt work out of tier 1 incident response and analysis. So let's see, that could be some more interesting jobs for the SOC folks. And with that question about cybersecurity being largely a question of AI offense and defense, and every day being 0 day, about 2/3 of our respondents thought that that was probably about right. Equally, 2/3 of our respondents agreed that AI will report a breach before humans know about it. So then, what is the role for the human in that space? And how do we deal with regulation, with compliance? If I think about those of us who are ruled by the General Data Protection Regulation and the requirement to notify within 72 hours. Well, those time requirements could be a nonsense if it's an automated report. Where does the human get in there to make sense of what has happened? And where does legal liability lie? How does legal liability operate when you have a world of automated notifications? It also means, of course, doesn't it, that attribution could become less feasible and potentially less important. And I think we're already, I see some of you nodding, and I think we already have some current signals of that, that if you are defending against an attack, you are the least interested in where that attack is coming from. The people who are interested are your national cybersecurity agencies, your law enforcement officers, your regulators. So if we have automated reporting, automated breach notification, it could well be that more of a business's, more of an organization's resources are shifted towards prevention, readiness, deterrence, etc. I'm not going to cover all of these, but some of these are quite fun. So when I mentioned about countries launching cyber attacks on each other by mistake and with no human intervention, well, people were quite divided on that. About 54% said they thought that was perfectly reasonable by 2030. And I don't know, I'm no statistician really, but if 54% thinks that that's perfectly reasonable, then that would suggest that it might happen, right? It might not. We might not get to hear about it, even if it does happen. There's that other consideration, isn't there? So I'm going to focus in on two things here to finish off. The first is trust, truth, and authenticity. And that really is about the consideration of when we have synthetic influencers already, when we have fashion models that do not exist outside of data, influencers on Instagram encouraging us to buy things who do not exist outside of data, when we have deceased actors being retrofitted into movie franchises, we are already getting used to the idea that some of the people we interact with might not be, quote unquote, real people offline. And yet at the same time, we're trying to develop technologies to identify manipulated media and deepfakes. So we're kind of being a little bit contradictory in that respect. And I think as society gets more and more used to not dealing with a real offline human, because let's face it, we've been pushing chatbots to them for some years, it may become more challenging for ordinary individuals to determine what is authentic. And it may be the case that technical measures might not be enough. So again, that goes back to the critical thinking piece. And then finally, my favorite, which is embodied cybersecurity. Now, we have been thinking for many years, have we not, about cyber physical threats. And we've thought about that mainly in relation to critical infrastructure, but also partly, I think, with relation to some of those hacks of implantable medical devices, cardio defibrillators, insulin pumps, etc., continuous glucose monitors. But I want to take you into something slightly different, and that is very much about the metaverse. So we thought that widespread adoption of brain-computer interfaces was a little too ambitious for 2030. We thought there would be an opportunity for medical use cases, as we're already seeing in the treatment of Parkinson's disease with some early adopters and some testing there. And we thought that there would be people who are quite keen on having brain-computer interfaces for other reasons. Gaming environments, for instance, you could see as being early adopters. We take our signals also from current use of VR. We know it's still clunky, but we have already seen, for instance, early adoption some years back, 5 or 6 years ago, by the adult entertainment industry. And I would say this was entirely not safe for work, and that's why I've not put it on a slide. But if you are interested, Feel free to Google Kiroo, Kiroo, Amsterdam, and you will see video of a gentleman enjoying himself in an immersive adult entertainment experience. This stuff is out there already. And if it's out there already, it's already liable to misuse. So what I'm really talking about here is the emotional feedback loop, the psychological feedback loop of feeling really there. And as you will all know, millions of people already feel like this without VR. They already feel like they are in Fortnite. They already feel like they are in their immersive experiences. But the more we have that sense of being 360, the more we have that sense of being physically connected, the more people who work in information security will be drawn into investigations of emotional, psychological, and physical harm, the more information security specialists will be called to testify at post-mortem investigations. It's something to bear in mind that this won't just be about, in the words of one of our questionnaire respondents, it will be about losing humans, not data. And if we're thinking about current signals, we already had the German Federal Police, the BKA, during COVID, launching a homicide investigation because of a ransomware attack at a hospital in Dusseldorf. So the signals are there, but we need to bear in mind that this physicalized, this embodied cybersecurity is only going to increase the more we have haptic technology, the more we have physical sensation, the more we feel immersed in these environments. On the left there, of course, you have Neuralink. On the right there, you have the completely unrelated, but possibly intellectual property infringements that is Tesla's suit. And it has lots of pads that are air pressure, and so that you can feel the sensation, the impact of being touched or hit. And I have to share with you my abiding and overwhelming feeling whenever I see this image, and it is, don't those people look fantastic in those suits? Do we think there might have been a bit of airbrushing? Because I suspect, as much as I have a healthy sense of self-importance, I suspect that if I were to put on one of those suits, I would look rather like I was wearing an ill-fitting wetsuit. And everybody knows that wetsuits look better in your imagination than they do when they're on. So that's something to bear in mind for the future. So concluding thoughts. Will the future of cybersecurity resemble Nusan Joban? I don't know. You'll need to ask me in 10 years' time, and we can find out then, or 8 years' time, and we can find out then. In a way, it doesn't matter, because the very fact that we're doing scenario exercises, it can give us different perspectives on developments that we may have missed or undervalued. And that was certainly the case when I started thinking about VR, haptics, immersive environments. It actually gave me a different perspective on how much people were already emotionally and psychologically affected by their connected and by their online experiences. And that perhaps we hadn't given that enough attention, particularly in criminal justice. It also gives us different perspectives on drivers and ongoing changes. So regardless of whether a specific threat manifests itself by 2030, what we have been able to establish is that we're not bad at identifying those changes in the operating environments that will be relevant to our businesses and our organizations and our lives as consumers, whether or not those specific threats manifest themselves. I do have a couple of hot tips. I definitely, if I were going to put some money on anything, it would be on physical assault in the metaverse and how that's going to be a bit challenging, but also data poisoning attacks. But I hope, particularly for those of you that have got longer range strategies, longer range business plans, I hope I've given you enough food for thought for you to go away and think about what you are going to do and what you're going to have to worry about beyond next year's trend and threat reports. Thank you very much indeed.